All right, so here basically what we just covered is a few diagrams of how the simple box changes, and then how every change changes the panels, and then how every panel is translated into a plane. Changes the planes, and how every plane is changed into a panel. Too many P's. So once you know that, then we can say you can understand a lot easier what your draft fundamentally represents. Your draft fundamentally represents a block, and if you would open that block, half of that, what you would see is the front plane, which is just one rectangle, side plane, one rectangle, and back plane. As easy as that. And what you're doing essentially when you're creating a pattern, if you completely ignore the necklines and the shoulder lines, all you're doing is just making sure that you're measuring the right width length and width, and drawing that on this rectangle and making sure that your rectangle is the rectangle it should be for that figure. Now, further down the line, and that's what we're going to cover now, is shape. Because clearly you're not just a block, you're a block with a lot of shape. So then what we have to do is to make sure that we observe the shape correctly, but also translate the shape correctly onto this simplified block, so that we add where literally we need to add and take away where we literally need to take away. So the main things that you would need to create a basic pattern eventually is neck width, so you know you have the right neck circle, back balance, front balance, shoulder angle, cross back, cross chest, armhole width, and that's pretty much it. Your side seams theoretically could change and be wherever you want them to be if you need to design in a way that you display seams and do all of that for visual purposes. But for technical purposes of sculpting around something that has a shape, you are limited to where you can place your underarm and side body seam. Like, from a technical point of view, you cannot have the opinion that you can put the underarm seam like 2 meters further out, because that's not where the shape is that you want the shape to be on your pattern. All right, so then we get to the shape. We've covered the basic block. Now we are onto how do we translate actual shape onto this basic block, onto this basic draft. To do that, the first thing that we have to do is to see the person as a silhouette. So we've seen the person as a block, now we have to see the person as a silhouette. Side view and front view or back view, doesn't really matter that much. You could say front view and side view is plenty. But when you see the person as a silhouette, what you have to do at the same time is create this frame around them so that they snugly fit into that frame. Because you will need that frame to, for example, see what the distance is between this point and this point, which is the hip. You know, you draw a line straight down here, you see this gap here. That is what you need to extract out. And the same on the side. If you would draw a line from just right under the armpit straight down, and the hips are smaller in this case, you would see a small gap there. If the hips were bigger, then clearly you would use the hips and then draw a line straight up, and then you would see a gap at the top, vice versa. Now, when we are drafting, it's really the upper body, the torso and the hips that are the biggest masses that, when aligned in a particular way, they create the gesture of the person. We talked about mass distribution the last time, and then there was this topic we talked about is like, isn't posture the same as figuration, basically? And then I was like, yes, it is, but at the same time we have to make a distinction between how the person is temporarily standing and how their body is generally sitting in terms of mass. So here's the thing. When we're drafting, we don't really try to bring the shape in from the shoulders. This triangle doesn't move that much. It's mainly the upper and the lower torso that changes dramatically, and then you get an erect person or a stooped person or just a normal person. This is very different than this. But this triangle is not that different from that. It roughly stays in the same alignment of the body. If anything, it just tilts a little bit more forward or backward, but that is really causing the tilt. and that is really causing the gesture. So far, so good? Yeah. So what do we do? This is what you're about to see is basically my attempt to create an instruction on how you translate your observation onto the paper. And so here's the thing. You look at the person as a silhouette from the side, okay? Then you, for example, in this case, his back is further back than his hip. You look at the furthest point on the silhouette, you draw a line straight down or straight up, depending on which one is the wider one, and then you'll notice a gap. So the distance between the farthest point and the most inward point, that's what you have to register. Now, you don't need to register any measures yet. The measures you take by going around the circumference with your tape measure. But you notice that there is a gap. His lower torso is more forward than his upper torso. You do the same for the side, and so that's the same. That's step one. That's one procedure. That's one layer. The second layer, what you do is you deal with the hollowness. So the first one deals with the displacement. Is this block further out or further in? And then the second layer says, okay, now how much hollowness is there? Because they're two separate things. Just because the hip is more inward doesn't mean it's also more hollow. It could just be a straight line. So once you observe the figure like that, you could say, I know where and how the negative space on that figure looks like. Now I have to translate it on my pattern. And so this is how it then goes, in very simplistic terms. You draft the basic block, you decide on what the length is, then you take the widest circumference, whether that's the hip, the waist, or the chest, as the width of the entire block. Then, as you noted on the figure, you make rough estimations of where you saw the negative spaces. So we know that there was this gap because the hips were smaller than the rib cage, basically. So that's roughly where we observed the wedge. And then you had the back, the hip was a bit more forward. You can choose, if you don't have a side body, to take it all from the center back or distribute it a little bit from the center back and a little bit from the side seam. Now, the reason why I think we have a side body is because we can put more shape into the body without creating too many distortions on the material. The less seams you have, the more you have to take from those seams if you really want to shape something. But there is a limit into how much you can shape. You know, if you take a center back seam and you really make a round on it, it's never going to work on a person that doesn't literally have a ball on their back. It's just going to collapse into ripples, and then you may think it's a tightness across, but it's actually just a too round of a seam. So distribution should be done as much as possible. Now, once you've made a rough estimate, like literally like what we were talking about, you look at the person standing and you're like an artist and be like, oh, that's a bit hollow there and that's a bit hollow there. You have marked the areas where shape needs to be taken away because you've used the widest circumference, so you don't touch that. You touch what needs to be taken away. And to take away something, you need to know where it should be taken away from. So that's that level. Then, once you've done that, please ignore this blue one. Essentially, you have your negative spaces. Now, how do you quantify how much this should be? For that, you have your measures. So if I measure around your chest and you're like, whatever, and your hip is 3 inches smaller, then I'm like, oh, right, so I have to make the hips 3 inches smaller. But then I also need to know where am I making it smaller. You can't just randomly say, oh, because his hip is smaller, I'm going to reduce from the front or from the side or from the back. Unless you are hollow at the back, or you're hollow on the sides, or you're hollow on the front. So if you stand like a proper S-curve, right? So suppose your bust circumference measure would be like, let's say 30, for example. And then your hip would be 20. That means I have to remove 10 inches from your hip if I really want to create a super fitted look. But because you stand like an S, I can't just randomly say, right, I'll just take it from the front edge. That's exactly where you need the thing. So observing that the biggest wedge of negative space is at your back, I'll have to make sure that I remove that 10 inches, the majority of that 10 inches from the back. So that's a very crucial thing, because if you take a garment, even if it's larger than you, but the shapes have been addressed properly in the right areas, it would still look fitted. It wouldn't look big. A lot of time when you get misfits and drags, and while the measures are technically correct, and you're like, how is it like his hip is like 3 inches bigger, but it still looks too tight? It probably is because the shape isn't taken away from where it should be taken away from. So then you get your negative space, and then if you go through the FBI resolution adding system, you add the hollowness, which is again helped by your measures, and then you basically get the pattern. That's it. So to summarize it, you observe the negative space. You observe the negative space in 2 stages. The first stage is difference in position, and the second stage is amount of hollowness. Then you make your block by taking the widest circumference, and then you marking where the major reductions have to be. So in this case, that's the side and the back. And then you use your measures to then quantify how much you take away from where. And then you add the hollowness. That's going to be your waist measure, and then bam, you have your pattern. That's essentially how you mechanically do it.
Are you intending for this to be a method that's done like in my notebook, where if I just had that as my standard on my order form, and I'm looking, and like you said with
I love you.
just because by doing that, you're already getting, I don't need any measurements like you were saying earlier. I can just say, all right, you are there.
That's it, man.
And then you can, drop in a little bit, and you're just slowly getting that shape.
Yes, absolutely. So there are 2 types of the 2 main categories of sculpting is like subtractive and additive.
Yeah.
Right? We work with the subtractive because we can't put a small garment on the person and then see where we can add. That just doesn't fit them. So we put a bigger garment on them and then we reduce.
Yeah.
And so if you're doing that, you might as well look at the person as a block of stone and then decide where the things have to be cut out.
Yeah.
And so what you remain with is basically the perfect fitted garment. Now, people in the made to measure have solved this problem by creating a block pattern and then putting it on the person, then measuring it and then making the changes. And then they're like, if you do that, then you're already a fitting ahead without having even drafted the person's pattern, right? You all know that trick. Which is good if you're making mass-produced garments or you have a very, very incredibly high volume and there is no artistic conceptualization within the business. But as a bespoke tailor, you're really pretty much an artist, especially if you're 1 person or max 3 people. And so here's the thing. If you can do that and achieve the perfect fit without even having to make a damn garment block, then you know something beyond that block that you put on a person and then you make changes to. Then you know exactly how to translate shape into pattern. And that's what we want to get at.
But then going back to observations, we are all benefiting from the point that this person doesn't have any arms on them. And I've noticed when I take photographs, the first thing that happens is the guys stand like this, just completely obstructing where their hips are.
Doesn't matter.
So, but how do you then read that as a tailor, as a cutter, of exactly what the distance between this point and this point is if it's being obstructed?
You can do 2 things. This is what artists do when they draw. So, So if you, for example, want to draw a person and you kind of like draw their head, and then you're like, right, now I need to draw their shoulders, but they're a bit shrugged, so the shoulder falls back behind the head. Instead of doing this, what you do is you draw the head and you make one line. Bless
Sorry.
you. You make one line across, right? So you also see what's behind the head. Now, if you stand in front of me and you have your hands in front of your hips, I could still continue the line because your hands are not bigger than the entire lower torso. I could continue the line, and if the difference is so little, then I would just ignore it, or I would just in my mind say, okay, maximum 3/8 I'm going to take out of that entire place. But if I can visibly see, like Mowgli has wide hips and she has a very narrow upper torso, so unless she's wearing something like this, then what you should do, then all you need to do is just pin everything from the back so that you get more like, there are ways around that. But when looking at her, I could just look at her hips and then draw the line straight up, and I'll see this massive gap between the hips and the rib cage.
Yeah.
And so I can then say, well, if I would look at the side view, is that gap the same size as, for example, her hips being forward? Then you relate it to the rest of the anatomy. So then it's a game of proportions. If you know that the gap she has on the side is a lot bigger, like double the gap she has on the back, for example, then you account for that in proportions, but then you fine-tune it with the measures. That's how you would do it. So I wouldn't say it's a big deal if someone covers their hips with their hands.
Well, I'm saying in terms of like, especially for new pattern cutters and tailors, trying to read the body and wanting to get the best information out. And like you said, your eye will naturally fill in gaps that are obstructed, but I'm sure there are lots of people who won't have
exercise.
that confidence. Yeah.
So then we can create an exercise saying, take a photograph of someone and then mark a dot where you think the widest point of their hip is. Mark a dot where you think just under the armpit. Connect that line. Do that on a few. You can easily go on internet and be like standing man, like big standing man, thin standing man, or whatever. And you can do that exercise until you get used to it and have that mental tool in your mind.
Or you could give them that already. You could give that exercise to them already.
That's what I'm saying. You create that exercise. So within this system,
so they don't
that's what I mean as well. You create that, just like they make the person a block. You give that exercise. So good point. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. So then once you've done that, you pretty much have the pattern. And if you go through this process, I believe, a few times, and we're going to fine tune this, but roughly that's the entire process. You go through that a couple of times, your eye becomes sharper, you know how to do all of this better. I think you can get very close to a very, 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 very good fit within the first draft. So that's that. Now there are other things that we have to work with, which you need to know if you're continuing, doing this in the best possible way. And so there are certain restrictions, and the thing with restrictions is it really depends what the situation is. So one restriction that I'm going to talk about is not something that always is a restriction, but you can explain to them when it's a restriction. So 2 restrictions. If you look at, for example, the profile view of someone, and you're like, right, if it means that I can extract out negative spaces from the back and the side, then why don't I extract the negative space from the back and then apply that on the pattern? And then what that basically means is you get a very curved center back. And the same goes from the front. You can analyze this or observe this negative space on the front and then be like, right, so this point, this red dot essentially is the pit of the neck. Well, the hip is like really forward, so I'll just add whatever to the front. You can do that, but then you have to think of 2 things. Any severe curve on the pattern, if there isn't literally a ball, as I said, on the body, is going to fail. So your lines, and you remember when we drafted your pattern, you looked at it and you're like, this is really weird, but the back was kind of like sculpted into your back. But when you look at the pattern, it's not really shaped that much. And so the reason is it doesn't need to be shaped a lot if the shape is just taken out the correct area. And anything that's too severe and creates severe curves like this will fail, because when you join a round seam, and you try to lay it flat and smoothly on a flatter surface, that bubble is just going to stay there. And so eventually it's going to collapse and it's going to be like waves. And so that's not going to work. This would only work if the person really had just like a volleyball on their back. And even then I wouldn't recommend to take it all from one place. The other restriction here is if we were working, for example, with something that didn't have stripes or checks, like a fine grain fabric, like any blue pop sack, whatever, or leather even, you know, you're making a leather garment, you could easily translate this negative space to the front of the pattern. But if you're working with stripes and, for example, you're making a shirt, even on jackets this doesn't matter, but if you're making a shirt, you know, you want the stripe to roughly run just one line from the top to bottom. So in that case, you can't just add whatever you wish to the front and create like this crooked line. Although technically it isn't wrong. It's technically correct to do that if it requires the shape to be there. But because of the grain and beauty aesthetic restriction, you tend not to do that if you have a straight front, like a Nero jacket or whatsoever. So those are the two small restrictions. Sip of tea. Then we get into suppression, because eventually negative space means also that we have to incorporate suppression, and suppression has its own fundamental rules. And so there are a couple of things that you need to know about suppression. Is that it's very obvious but important. Suppression in the waist seams is essentially just concave lines. So you shouldn't think about it as suppression creating shape. You should think about suppression as concave lines. And the reason why you have to think about suppression as concave lines is because concave lines have like a physical restriction, is that they don't want to curve over themselves. They have to be free of tension. Now, another thing with suppression is that suppression doesn't sit just where it wants to sit in the air. It's always being pulled down by gravity. And when it is being pulled down by gravity, it distorts everything else that follows it through. So, the law of the concave line. Any concave line, this is what I forgot last time, I couldn't remember the line. Any concave line that wants to fold back onto itself whilst maintaining a concave line along the folded edge must be free of tension. So you have a concave edge, you fold that back, you don't have a concave edge anymore. But if you did want to have a concave folded line, you have to break the tension here, snip it, and then you can move it forward. We do this by stretching the concave lines, and then it rolls back on itself. That's one thing. Nobody thinks about this, but it has to be in your mind all the time, because you're dealing with a lot. If you create, you see the shoulder on that jacket, if you stand up, you see that the shoulder seam on top is being pulled. You can see drags, miniature drags. Have a look. You see?
Yeah.
So that is a concave line that isn't stretched out. Now, if you pull the shoulder outwards, it smoothens. So if I would stretch it with the iron, you would get a smooth line. And so you would think about this like concave lines are everywhere. And people tend to think like, oh, concave lines is just the thing on the sleeve that I stretch out. But you have it on the side seams, you have it on the underarm seams, depending on how severe, obviously, they are. And then you have it on the transition between the lapel edge to the front edge. So if you're working with a lot of inlay on your front edge, you have to stretch that concave line for it to actually roll properly. And you have it on the shoulder and anywhere else where you have concave lines. Yeah. Right? So that's why it's so crucial. The other thing is that darts have to be as symmetrical as you can make them. Asymmetrical darts, so this is what happens. So when you're closing a dart, essentially you have two hollow lines that are pulled together towards a center line. Now, when these two are pulled towards a center line, they distort both edges. Right? You have an intake of 3/8 on either side, you bring them together, and it elevates the sides, right? Now, the dart that we have here has just a straight center line. It's just one straight line. Now, what happens is if you have an asymmetrical dart, which some people can use cleverly, for example, if you want to take a dart out but don't distort your front edge line or stripe, you can take an asymmetrical dart But here's the thing, you can only do that if you can attach your fabric to something that isn't going to move. Like your canvas has to be super rigid for it to really lock that fabric in, because if your canvas also has a asymmetrical dart, what you end up with is, in the beginning, this point is brought to the straighter one, and then you get, nice, straight front edge, then I have my distorted side. But then as you pull it, which is what gravity does, it pulls it from one end to the other, straight down, it corrects the center line of the dart to what it actually is, which is a bent line. And then once you get a bent line, then boom, both sides are distorted. And so you end up with a weird distortion on a place where you don't want it to be. And that is catastrophic if you're not aware of it. But you can use this method effectively.
They use that a lot in ready-to-wear women's wear.
Yeah.
For like Sue Studio and like Tailor Coat. I think Reese do it a lot as well. Where all the suppression's taken to the side, so the side panels are like
very very intense. Yeah. So it's good to know that. Then the last thing is, we looked at this previously. So if you have just a normal back panel, it just hangs, right? There's no suppression, nothing. Then in your mind, you tend to forget that gravity is always pulling this down. And so you suppress the center back and you're like, right, my center back is now nicely going into the back. But it isn't, because what happens is gravity is pulling it down. And as gravity pulls it down, it straightens your center back. And like we said, if you straighten a hollow seam, you make the straight line next to it hollow. Makes sense? So then what happens is exactly the same here. You straighten the hollow seam that you have here, and it hollows the straight seam next to it. And when that hollows, it pulls the center front back. So easily you can have your circumference measure correct, but just by adding suppression to your center back, you can just bring the entire garment backwards. And then you're like, what the fuck happened here? So that's another thing about suppression that's very important. So far, so good? Yeah? All right. Sip of tea. Then we go into taking measures. So, so I think we don't need more than 14 measures, max, to get like the perfect fit.
For the jacket.
For the jacket. 14 includes the one foot. Yeah, literally 14. Maybe it's going to be 15 eventually. I don't know how this is going to develop, but it's not going to be more than 14 or 15. If anything, I'd like to have 3 measures only, but that's going to be too simplistic. So here's the thing. I think complexity plus repetition plus time and evaluation becomes simplicity. You know, you go through a complex process over time, you repeat it that often until you know exactly what matters. And if you only have what matters, you're approaching it in a simple way. You look at factory machines, right? So complicated, hundreds of like mechanical parts, and then now the whole damn thing is like as small as a phone. And then the complexity is now within that, you know what I mean? And then simplicity is what matters, as I said, and nothing more, nothing less. So